Now, the Foreign Secretary Lord Cameron has warned that Israel could be in breach of international law if it fails to provide food and water to the people of Gaza. Answering questions in the House of Lords, he again raised concerns about Israel's plan to launch a military offensive on the city of Rafah in southern Gaza, where more than 1 million people have sought refuge.
They must obey international humanitarian law. And let's be clear, that involves not only what the IDF do in terms of the way they prosecute their actions in terms of this war, but it also means, as they are the occupying power in Gaza, that they have to make sure that humanitarian aid, that food and water and shelter are available to people in Gaza, because if they don't do that, that would be a breach of international humanitarian law as well.
Well, Lord Cameron also told the House that Britain still wants negotiations to achieve a two-state solution, and that would include recognising a Palestinian state.
Recognition is obviously part of a two-state solution, and it's something that should help with the momentum. The point I've been making is that it should not be the first thing that we do. I think that would take the pressure off the Palestinians to reform and the things that need to happen in the Palestinian Authority. But just because it doesn't happen at the beginning doesn't mean it has to wait right till the end. And I think one of the things that is beginning to change, which I think is hopeful, is the American posture up to now has been that recognition can only come when Israel and Palestine agree on the creation of a Palestinian state. Now, if you do that, you do effectively give Israel a veto over a Palestinian state, and I think that's the opposite of creating the sort of unstoppable momentum towards a two-state solution that we all want to see.
Good to have you with us. Let me ask you first of all about that very pointed warning from the Foreign Secretary that Israel must obey international humanitarian law and that if it doesn't allow in sufficient aid, it's not doing so.
Well, in some senses, it's a statement of uncontested fact. I think what makes this acute is the fact that Israel now seems to be bearing down on the one bit of Gaza where almost everyone has moved to. The refugees who've gone from the north of the Gaza Strip have gone down there to Rafah, and ultimately they really don't have anywhere else to go. So there's no sense that people can be displaced to another place, and Israel have to take that responsibility on themselves if they're planning to assault that area. The overcrowding is almost unimaginable. You've got already people in desperate need of food and other resources, and clearly, as I've said, there's nowhere they can be displaced to. So it would be very, very serious and desperate if it were to happen.
Do you get the sense that Israel is heeding these warnings from the UK? We've heard similar words from Joe Biden warning of the dangers and the importance of protecting civilians. I mean, it's only earlier this week that we heard Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, talking about total victory and talking about his still intention of destroying Hamas.
Yeah, and they've set that out as their objective, the destruction of Hamas by military means, and it's not at all clear that that's achievable. So I think to answer your question, certainly Netanyahu, I don't think wants to listen. I think there is clearly a tension within his administration. As we know, it's a coalition and he's at a fairly sort of hardline edge of it. But equally, given the events of October the 7th, there is still a lot of support in Israeli society for what might be termed finishing the job. I think the issue is that it may not be a job that can be finished in that military way.
There is a real danger, isn't there, that Israel is losing some of the support that it's had from its allies. I mean, people like the UK and the US are always insistent that, of course, Israel has the right to defend itself and recognising the horror of the Hamas attacks of October the 7th, but pointing out that can't mean the destruction of so many civilian lives in a place like Rafah.
Absolutely, and I think specifically on the American side, I mean, it's not unimportant what the UK thinks, but it's very important what the Americans think, and it's absolutely clear that they are becoming pretty impatient with Israel. Clearly, it's created all kinds of domestic difficulties for Biden, but also, perhaps much more importantly, the humanitarian crisis that we're already looking at tens of thousands of dead in Gaza, women and children, of course. and that's before we get into anything that might unfold in Rafah.
What about those comments from Lord Cameron about the recognition of a Palestinian state? Now, when he first suggested that the international community should recognize a Palestinian state at an early stage in negotiations towards the two-state solution, I mean, we are such a long way from any of those negotiations that it does seem perhaps as though this is all academic. But it is important, isn't it, about sending out a signal about a potential future diplomatic solution.
Yeah, it's very important, and of course the desired outcome being a two-state solution has been the policy of the UK and the policy of most countries for decades. What makes it interesting right now, though, is that we've got a Israeli government that is pretty clear that it doesn't want a two-state solution, and that's new because in the past, even when you've had relatively hardline Israeli governments, they've always accepted that in principle there ought to be some kind of solution which involves two states, albeit they might argue over the details. Whereas now it's pretty clear, it's entirely clear that Netanyahu's government does not foresee a two-state solution. So to some extent, why is Cameron saying this? I think in part to try to continue to bring pressure on the Israelis, but also I think actually the point that he made is a good one, that you have to give the Palestinians some reason for hope. Now, of course, in the past, there have been plans and proposals that the Palestinians would achieve statehood by a certain date, and those plans and proposals have fallen by the wayside. So we don't really know where this particular initiative will take us.
Just finally, we're hearing that there are negotiations for a ceasefire between, or a pause in the fighting, at least, as the parties like to describe it, between Israel and Hamas, which have resumed in Cairo. That's according to Egyptian sources. Given everything else that is going on, those words that we've been discussing from Benjamin Netanyahu, do you think there is the realistic prospect of another pause in the fighting, which could perhaps lead to the exchange of more prisoners and hostages?
I think it's quite possible. It's effectively a sort of separate track which has been ongoing, led by the sort of intelligence chiefs, the CIA, the Egyptians, the Qataris, and they have managed in the past to negotiate these pauses, which has led to the release of some hostages. Of course, we're reaching a stage where we don't know exactly how many are still living. Of course, some have been sort of confirmed as having died, but the question of hostage releases is paramount in the minds of the Israeli public for very understandable reasons. So I think that's something where it's pretty difficult for Netanyahu to sort of ignore that opportunity if it looks like it's on the table.